speak in the airport on way back from Sudan. So connectivity is not at its best. So I'll be stepping in to moderate and assist with the session to the extent possible. So a warm welcome to all, and thank you, Dr. Mahmoud, for the opportunity to bring us together with our distinguished co-authors, Dr. Sameh Wahba, Dr. Maria Alejandra Gonzalez-Perez. I hope I've got that right, Maria, and Dr. Miral Shehata. And I'm really pleased, and I have to tell you that, Dr. Mahmoud, organizing that at the 11th hour was challenging, but you made it all easy for us. Before you joined, everybody was saying how you, to each and every one, you're a friend and a mentor. So I'm really pleased that Dr. Abla Abdel Latif, Dr. Sarah Al-Khashin, and Dr. Susanna El-Massah they were all able to join really came forward very positively at a very short notice. So with that, I will be supporting the session. The session is being recorded and broadcasted live on the ERF YouTube channel. I'd like to start by extending a warm welcome, Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, as the first author, distinguished professor, Cairo University. And it's always difficult to introduce Dr. Mahmoud. I will be doing that in the chat. But as we all know, Dr. Mahmoud is also the UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for Egypt. And without further ado, Dr. Mahmoud, please, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Shireen, for the generous introduction. Very grateful to the Economic Research Forum, to yourself and Dr. Badawi for giving us this opportunity to present the finding and some highlights of this recently published book by Palgrave on business, government, and the Sustainable Development Goals, in which we try to highlight the role of public-private partnerships in achieving the SDGs. And the book, which is available, I think I made a copy available of it to the library of the Economic Research Forum. And there is another copy at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science that I sent last week, is basically built on three main chapters, one on each of the topics, on government, on the business sector, and on the local and regional government. And of course, as always, there is some introductory chapter and concluding remarks. And the publication of this book is, I would say, timely, because this year in particular is going to observe three important summits at the margins of the General Assembly in September, an SDG summit to take stock of updates on achievements or lack of achievements on the SDGs at the country level. There is going to be another summit on finance for development, and the third summit on climate. And I'm happy that this book is tackling issues of concern and trying, given that we are halfway through the 2030 deadline, is to try to be helpful in the acceleration of the SDGs, and trying to get some lessons from the old days of the MDGs and get some ideas as well from countries that did better than others in getting the government, the business sector, and the local governments, and through that, local communities as well, involved in the implementation. I understand that Miral is managing the slides, and I'll be super fast. Yeah. So we are suffering in the sustainable development practice from the prevalence of a reductionist approach, in which we are not really taking SDGs as a system, I like their design, the practice, and the push towards achieving the SDGs had remained to a great extent very much siloed. Even if countries are trying to do something on education, SDG 4, on health, SDG 3, or gender, SDG 5, or investing in infrastructure that could be captured in SDG 8 or SDG 11, they don't really have a system approach. And for that is not just in admiration of the advantage and beauty of being holistic and comprehensive, but when it comes to implementation, there is a great deal of importance here that should be given to resource allocation. And to avoid overlap and to avoid budget resource redundancies. We don't see that just on different individual SDGs, but when people talk about climate as if it's a separate agenda, at the end of the day, climate action is SDG 13. And again, the climate action had been isolated from the SDGs, while any kind of meaningful action in climate, it's either investment in renewable energy, which is SDG 7, or dealing with adaptation, which is primarily working on cities, SDG 11, or dealing with challenges in coastal areas or in agriculture and nutrition, SDG 2, or water management, SDG 6. So here we're missing a lot by not really having all of these vision and that is prevalent in the Arab countries. In many countries now we have them, but these or these visions are not necessarily translated into national frameworks, and that national framework is not attached to a financial framework, and that is not adequately translated to a budget with priorities, and that has a lot to do with the lack of achievement of the SDGs that had assumed from the very beginning that they are going to be adopting a holistic approach, and they should really be taken as part of the solution, if not the whole solution sometimes, of crises. So you would see some officials and ministers, yes, we need to take the SDGs or climate action seriously, but we are overwhelmed with crises. But actually, the SDGs are being designed as a long-term development plan to deal with a world not really without shocks and variety of crises that are exposing the economies to, but basically there have been a great deal of factoring in the possibility of having disruptions and shocks to the system. Next, please. So it's fair to say that the SDGs are building on the experience of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, but they are more demanding, not just in the number of the goals from 8 to 17, or the number of indicators, or the number of targets, but basically the main thing here that benefited from the MDG that you cannot really be doing in one goal without really having this kind of a holistic approach. We cannot fight extreme poverty without investment in human capital, which is education and health, without investing in infrastructure, and without investing in resilience. But the difference here, which makes it more challenging of the SDGs, that it's not going to be relying on the success of a couple of countries. Be just simple in the assessment here, a couple of countries from 2000 to 2015 saved the day for the world. The achievements of China, Indonesia, and many countries, especially in East Asia, saved the day because the average looked good in terms of extreme poverty. For instance, the great achievement by China and the significant developments in poverty reduction in many Asian countries, and few countries as well from the South, had managed really to make us all looking good in the MDGs, and especially on SDG and MDG 1. That will not really help us a great deal on the SDGs, because here the accountability is at the country level. So I'm not going to get it by cover average. For that, we need really to understand the interlinkages between the different goals and targets, the political economy dynamics, and what's helping and not helping the design of policies and institutions, and how to get that all right in the ultimate way on distribution and allocation of resources, which is budget. And I've been always challenging ministers of finance, planning, and economy that of different countries who really has a dependable budget that we can call it an SDG-based budget, or even shadowing the SDGs. I don't think that we really have a good score of countries that manage to do that. And then, of course, we need really to go into dealing with matters when it comes to partnership with the business sector and localization to get matters done. Mind you, we are using localization rather than centralization versus decentralization, just to be practical about what could be achieved. And they have masters of their trade that are helping us to understand better in the business side, Professor Maria Alejandra Gonzalez-Perez, or Dr. Sameh, who has decades, I don't like to add to his age, but he's one of the most experienced implementers of reforms in variety of countries in different conditions of development, from poor to middle income to relatively rich. So are trying to bring this kind, not just the knowledge of the theory, but in the practice to get things done. Next, please. 3 elements for success to get matters seriously: availability of data, good policy design and effective implementation through good institutions, and adequate finance. And I'll mention them in the order in the slides. So you can go to slide, the next slide, please, on these kind of confusing, overwhelming figures. If you check as we speak now, Google, please, the figures coming from OECD DAC, you will find a reference to what we're talking about here, that we need 3.3 to $4.5 trillion per year in developing economies to achieve the SDGs. This figure back in 2015 was around $2.5 trillion. After the shock of COVID, that figure exceeded 4 trillion. Whether to take these figures seriously or not, I say, well, do we take it really just as guesstimates for what's required at the global level? Your best assessment should be coming from the knowing what's happening in a bottom-up approach at the country level. And we don't really have these kind of adequate costing. We have some good attempts based on some models and analysis, like the one conducted by Vitor Gaspar 4 years ago or more at the IMF, when roughly a developing economy would really have an additional requirements of around 4.2% in order to achieve the SDGs. So for a country like Egypt, it would need something like that. If your country in question is a low-income country, the need for increasing the resources will be as much as 15 percentage points in increase. Imagine this is the kind of gap that needs to be bridged. Of course, that will not definitely come from the budgets of the state. You would always assume that there could be reprioritization, better allocation of resources. But without the private sector, domestic and external, you cannot really achieve the SDGs, especially that there is some sort of good assumption that areas like education and health are going to be primarily coming from public resources. But other areas like SDG 8, when it comes to inclusive growth and creation of jobs, this should be coming in partnership with the business sector. If you are talking about the resilience through climate action, you will be seeing mitigation will be primarily coming from the business sector. And that's why we need really to get this issue of the finance for development right, which gets me into the second slide, please. And here, this could be a kind of reminder of the huge overlap of figures. I just told you that in order to achieve the SDGs globally, if you believe the figures coming from the OECD, it's ranging between 3 to 4.5 trillion. And then if you are asking the IEA, the International Energy Agency, which is located, by the way, in the same place like OECD, a couple of miles away from the OECD, they would tell you that trillions are going to be required in energy, which is SDG 7. So here you'll be seeing a great deal of confusing figures if you see them at the global level. During COP27, there was a report commissioned to a group of experts led by Nick Stern and Vera Songwe, and with them 12 experts. They estimated the requirements for climate action, focusing on mitigation, to be around $1 trillion a year from now until 2025. After that, until 2030, you'll need $2.4 trillion. So if you are assuming here that climate action is SDG 13, is part of the SDG 17, and we're going to be avoiding any kind of overlap and repetition and double counting, I think the only solution to fix these kind of global confusion of figures is to go deeply at the country level and to understand the SDGs at large, how much they would be costing, and then you can really do the simple adding up, which is not really there with us. Having said that, it's not just for climate action, but for the SDGs, unfortunately, because budgets of the states are overwhelmed by wages, salaries, and paying back debt and with their debt service, you would be seeing that many countries of the developing world are relying more and more on debt instruments. Actually, in the case of the world at large, you will be seeing that debt instruments are responsible for 62% plus of climate finance. In the cases of the developing economies, you'll be seeing that the reliance on debt could be even more than the 61% mentioned here, could be north of 75 or 80%. So the solutions will come toward the end when we're sharing some concluding remarks. Next, please. Just here to wrap up this part, I would say take these SDGs as holistic as we should. They could be explained in seconds as SDG 17 is never a goal, but it is imposed as a goal. But let's take it because it's the UN decision to make it a goal, inheriting it from the MDGs, because we had the MDG 8 as in partnership as a goal. But imagine that it's a goal, but governance is a goal, and it's not really that costly to have. It has a cost, but not really costing you as more as the economic aspects like infrastructure or water management or energy would cost you. So we put that in a kind of a pyramid shape in a way, based on the framework of partnerships. You need to be based on governance. You need to deal with the economic aspects of it. Social and human development are more important than the economic fiscal aspects. And then you need to take matters related to the shocks of the system, environment and climate. If you manage to do well in the investments in human capital, in infrastructure and resilience, you will do wonderfully well in ending extreme poverty and inequality. Of course, those who are experts, especially in poverty and inequality, they would tell you it's not really that mechanical, yes, but there is, as I said, an institutional framework and policy coordination framework behind the whole thing. It's all assuming that policy coherence and good integration of the policies are being tackled when we are dealing with these matters. One final slide before I ask Miral to step in. Yes, these are the three investments required. Physical infrastructure, including digital now, investment in human capital, health and education, and investment in resilience of economy and society, especially in climate change. One thing could be, again, of great relevance to the participation of the business sector and doing business at the local level. You will be seeing that matters related to governance are very much important. It's not just about transparency and accountability. But even if you are just concerned about efficiency, here are these kind of alarming figures that advanced economies lose as much as 15% of cost. Emerging markets and developing economies lose as much as 34% of the cost of doing these infrastructure projects, and more than 50% is lost in the low-income developing countries because of lack of governance and because of efficiency loss. So taking matters related to governance, and this is based on a recent piece by in a book by Schwartz and a group of economists within, in addition to that chapter that we got this figure from, which I encourage you to have a look at it when you can. Now it's your turn, Miral, in a very important topic on data. Without data, we cannot get it done. Go ahead.
Thank you, Doctor. So I'm going to talk mainly about the third element of success, which is dependable data. It's important to firstly emphasize that the 2030 agenda looks at data not just as a progress monitoring function, but also it emphasizes that high quality disaggregated data is key for smart, informed, and transparent decision making, which in turn strengthens the means of implementation and improves policy making processes at all levels. This is because governments need to understand people's vulnerability, evaluate services and programs, and anticipate future opportunities, risks, and trends. As such, in the book, we emphasize that governments need three types of data. The first is like timely data to be able to evaluate the efficiency of policies and interventions in a timely manner. Secondly, historical data to understand past trends and capitalize on past lessons. Thirdly, forward-looking data modeled to better prepare for the future. And we realized that we needed these three types of data in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which required timely and disaggregated data to administer both short and long-term recovery measures. This is also the case with the current crises where governments are trying to administer packages targeted at households hardest hit by the surging cost of living crisis. But when we look at national data systems in their response to the demand spike for data amidst the COVID-19, we can say that national data systems were for the most part unprepared to respond for this demand. Despite that, we can witness some innovation, for example, the surge in the use of geospatial data. However, this unpreparedness of the data systems has exacerbated the global data inequalities that existed before the pandemic, especially in developing and least developed countries. For instance, a survey by the United Nations and the World Bank found that in sub-Saharan Africa, 97% of the respondent countries said that their national data and statistical operations were actually cut due to the pandemic. Additionally, the pandemic has disrupted the data collection on the population groups that are hardest to reach and that were, for the most part, hardest hit by the pandemic. So this, it's a loop. So thus limiting the government capacities to design responses to alleviate the effect of the pandemic. Besides this, there is global data inequality between the developed and developing nations. This is best captured by the statistical performance indicator, which measures the statistical performance of a nation across 5 pillars, which are data use, data services, data products, data sources, and data infrastructure. For instance, developing countries scored much less than developed countries, especially on the data sources and infrastructure pillars. However, when we look at all countries, even the top performers, we found that the commonality among all countries is that they all do badly on the pillar 3, which is the data products, which measures the ability of the country to produce relevant indicators, especially for the SDGs, as providing a holistic list of indicators that span all domains. Additionally, as the lower figure shows, there are marked differences across the different SDGs in terms of data availability and timeliness. For instance, Goal 13 on climate action and SDG 14 on life below water encounter the dual problem of limited coverage as well as time lag in reporting, highlighting the substantial gap for environmental SDG indicators. But the question here is, why should we focus on SDG indicators? Because SDG indicators, as I was saying, by nature provide a well-rounded view of the status on the health, social, and economic fronts for all different age groups, as well as vulnerable population, in addition to capturing the status of environmental developments. And the varied effect of the COVID-19 on these groups and the different geographic hit by the pandemic actually calls for starting to look into more measures that go beyond the GDP, which has long been used as a measure for economic prosperity. The Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, which is the Stiglitz Commission, actually has highlighted the limit, scope, and inadequacy of the GDP. For example, it does not incorporate dimensions of well-being, distribution, the effect of digitalization, non-market activities, or economic and environmental sustainability. The GDP limitations are extended to the pandemic, as it did not capture the reflection of the pandemic on the care economy and the informal economy. And acknowledging such limitations, currently there is much work carried to update the 2008 system of national accounts. One of the main areas is to work is set to be completed by 2025, where they are trying to make some extended accounts on well-being and sustainability to feed into the main accounts. And this is the main approach adopted by the Intersecretariat Working Group on National Accounts by the UN. So even if we have timely, disaggregated, and comprehensive data, all of this should lie within the components of the national data system. And for this, we adopted the governance framework from the World Bank Development Report to 2021 Data for Better Lives. So a national data system can be seen as built on 5 main pillars: infrastructure policies, laws and regulations, economic policies, and the institutions needed to effectively govern the data transactions. These represent the layers of the data governance framework that should allow countries to realize the full economic and social value of both public and private intent data, as well as enhance the synergies between them. But these pillars need to be based on some foundations of human capital, trust, funding, incentives, and data demand. I'm not going to go in detail across all the layers because this is going to take a lot of time. But I want to highlight 2 main things. On the infrastructure policies, it's important to discuss the access issue because the richness of the data and its social and economic value is directly related to the number of citizens connected, although we all know that universal access is not an easy target. However, 2 important things here, that even within the range of broadband signal, approximately 40% of the world population lack access to the internet, conveying that policies should tackle the demand side barriers as well that limit service uptake. These include limited digital literacy, affordability, and relevance, and they contribute to the digital divide. Thing to realizing a gender digital divide, where statistics show that there are 250 million fewer women worldwide who use the internet than men. The other thing that I want to highlight is on the second layer of laws and regulations, because the legal and regulatory environment with the rules that both enable and govern the reuse sharing of data while protecting against possible data misuse are really important to actually instill trust in the data transactions within the system. I'm going to jump to the 4th layer, which is the institutions, because it's really important to have institutions which are formally mandated, equipped with technical capacity to undertake the mandated functions and have sufficient resources to be able to carry out these mandated functions. And these 3 characteristics overlap with some of the foundations of the data governance framework. I'm going to tackle 2 of them, which is the funding issue and the human capital issue. So data systems have long been underfunded, an issue which can be analyzed along 3 main dimensions: underinvestment by government, underinvestment by donors, fragmentation and lack of coordination. So on the first dimension, on the underinvestment by governments, there is always, you can find a formal expression by governments that data is important, and this expression is usually expressed in the voluntary national reviews submitted by the countries. But when you look at the investments, still investments in data are not seen as a political imperative, and the use of data is not yet viewed as fundamental in creating public value. This, coupled with the limited fiscal space, especially in developing countries, has led to underinvestment in data and aggravating the data inequalities among countries. For instance, among high-income countries, you can find that 93% have fully funded national data system compared to almost none in the low-income countries. So now we have like the donors dimension. When one look at the global donor commitments to data and statistics, it has been stagnant since 2015. And over half of the sub-Saharan African countries surveyed reported a decrease in funding from donors since the start of the pandemic. And lastly, even when the donors are undertaking investments in data systems, these investments are largely characterized by being short-term, and there are misaligned. There is misalignment and lack of coordination between the flows and the priorities of the national data system, as the donors' support is largely skewed toward the short-term investment rather than longer-term ones dedicated to strengthening the technical capacity, research and development, and infrastructure. In the book, we're proposing that the solution for this fragmentation of the government coordinate and own their data systems needs and align the funds coming from the donors with the national priorities to ensure sustainable results. This underfunding dilemma feeds into the human capital needs of the data systems, especially the capacities of the data producers and institutions, because the insufficiency of the fund directed towards long-term investments in technical capacity is resulting in limiting this capacity and the inability of national data offices to attract the skills needed in terms of personnel and statisticians, which in turn constrains the performance of public data producers. For instance, securing the skilled human resources or strengthening the capacities of the ones already on board has been cited by more than 80% of the African National Statistical Offices as one of the 5 most important targets for capacity development. So to conclude the data part, timely, disaggregated, and comparable data is a prerequisite for designing effective policies and reaching those who are farthest behind. Data allows for measuring policy and program impacts while highlighting the spillovers and contributing to the needed policy coherence that Dr. Mahmoud was talking about. However, large inequalities exist across countries in their data and the statistical capacity, and there is a gap between the expressed importance of data and the investments directed to data systems. Over to Professor Marie.
Thank you, Miral, and thank you, Dr. Mohieldin. I'm very, very, very thankful for the organization and the invitation by the Economics Research Forum for us to be here launching our book. So I'm going to talk here about our chapter on business and what is the role of business. As it was presented both by Dr. Mohieldin and by Miral, the SDGs were not necessarily created, were not created for business, but there is an increasing expectation of the importance of the private sector in the acceleration and meeting the SDG and the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. In here, so if we look at the role and why the private sector is important, like if we take data from the OECD, for instance, 70% of the entire added value of the countries are by the private sector and not by the public sector. So there is a great degree of complementarity here. The power of the private sector in the global economy is undeniable, and is undeniable in the way of shaping markets, in the way of shaping societies, in the way even of the contribution to the finance of the national and local governments. If we want to compare here some data, I know that is not, and we are aware that they are not comparable, but that one is just to give you an idea of the scale. If we take the net worth value of a company such as Apple, we are going to see here that this one, it is larger, even 9 times larger than a country like Egypt, or 9 times larger than the GDP of a country like Colombia. So we are not talking here about small power or even, so we are talking of huge amount of numbers. So if we take the number of, if we compare inhabitants by subscriber, we are seeing that Netflix, for instance, is a huge country, it's even larger, and the number of subscribers of Netflix are much larger. The country like Brazil, for instance, that is quite one of the largest countries in the world. Miral, next one, please. Next slide. So the contribution of more and more, it is expected, governments, the private sector more and more is expected to have both a contribution to the long-term competitiveness and to long-term profitability and long-term relevance, but at the same time, it is expected more and more that companies and the private sector contribute to sustainable development in the places where they operate. So like to have localized contribution to sustainable development and to have long-term relevance and long-term profitability. So this intersection between having long-term relevance and long-term competitiveness and profitability need to be crossed with this contribution to sustainable development. And in here is where there is the importance of collaboration. That is probably the main argument that we're having in this book. It is the collaboration between governments, both at the national and local level, with civil society organization, but also with the private sector, including the private sector, not only the firm itself, but its investors, its consumers, and everything that is within the value chain of the private sector. So business there face risk, the global and the local level, and there is this demand of incorporating, and also not only incorporating, but measuring how they are impacting both positive and negative to nature, society, and markets. So this contribution needs to be taken into account, and is like usually what we claim in the book. Then the main contribution is by implementing, incorporating ESG as environmental, social, and governance issues within their strategies. This concept of ESG was first coined in the year 2015 in this report, and it's called Future Proof. And it is there are consideration for portfolio for investment, but also for reporting to different shareholders. Next slide, please. So why companies most include, and why companies are incorporating ESG, where there are 3 major aspects. One thing is related to risk. Risks that have to do with climate change, and it was presented by Dr. Mohieldin. The main role of the private sector in climate change is in mitigation, but also the risks that are involved with the private sector are also in terms of adaptation and in terms of transition risk. That means the costs that are allocated for adapting to the new dynamics, for the new realities, the cost of insurance, the cost of the decrease of value of certain certain assets and properties and different set of assets. So one thing is like risk approach of of environmental and social issues. The other issues in terms of anticipating regulation that has to be done with energy transition, with climate change transition, with addressing poverty, with addressing inequality, but also in terms of marketing, tackling different set of investors with ESG preferences, or with consumers with ESG preference, but also in terms of labor force that might be more inclined to work for companies or prefer companies that have ESG consideration. Next slide, please. So if we look in terms of investors, ESG portfolios, we are talking here about investors that are caring more for the long term. And that one is long term. What is that? It's due different things. It's because when we have long-term investors, it is assumed that companies that are more inclined to have a corporate sustainability guideline or strategies, they will be in a possibility to consider future challenges or future risks within their present strategy. So for long-term investors, it is better to invest in these companies that incorporate the ESG. So especially because the long-term perspective of business include also that are related to managing reputation, climate change, and incorporation of the cost, early incorporation of anticipated regulation that might include might risk competitiveness of companies. Next one. So in here, so we are saying in here that there is this, of course, we have this eagerness and this need and this urgent need of acting immediately. But at the same time, is this concept of having an immediate action. Of course, the world right now demands urgency. Consumers require like actions immediately, and all the shareholders, but at the same time, we need this long-term perspective, and this long-term perspective that need to be localized. So this perspective that Professor and Dr. Susanna and her work with Dr. Mohieldin have emphasized, and the importance of this localization, with also together with this on downstream and upstream within the value chain. Technology and innovation are highly required, and that one also it is technology and innovation for acting, but also for measuring and demonstrating the contribution towards such advancement. Next slide, yeah, sorry, next, Miral. So, and here again, with the emphasis of the book, the importance of collaborating together. Remember that the SDGs were not created by the private sector, but the private sector is crucial for achieving the SDGs. Their collaboration, like we must have into account that the private sector generates value in different ways. Generates specifically climate economic value for governments in the form of taxes, but also in terms of society in the form of wages, but also in the terms of consumers of goods. For the financial sector, the private sector generate economic value in terms of capital to capital providers, and of course to shareholders, and one of the main shareholders that we discuss in the book are pension funds. So the profitability of business of the private sector is crucial for the long-term achievement of the SDGs, even if we just take into consideration its economic implication. But more and more, there is this process of measuring the externalities, the awareness of the top managers of the companies, of internalizing those externalization. Next slide, please. So in here, so as we were presenting this, a triple contribution of business. Number one, it is to be profitable, and to be profitable specifically to reach the long-term being profitable. So have a long-term profitability, to contribute to the SDGs, and also to be relevant, because the private sector is not only right now as to be a passive economic actor, more and more private sector is involved in policy making, and it's like this request of involved in global and local politics. It is more important. So one of the big recommendations that we do in the book, is the measurement and recognition of the negative impact that business must recognize and measure the negative impact, not only be aware of their operation, either intended or unintended, and internalizing those externalities to take responsibility for those, and incorporating those, internalizing these externalities in the way then they can prove their contribution to SDGs, and they could prove them to be more profitable if they internalize those externalities and be more relevant for the SDG agenda. Thank you, Miral. And thank you, colleagues. And thank you, Dr. Shireen for the organizing.
Thank you, Maria. I think Dr. Sameh is due now.
Thank you, Miral, and thank you very much for the ERF for hosting us for this book launch. Let me talk a little bit about the role that local and regional governments play towards the achievement of the SDGs, and I'll delve a little bit more into the notion of localization. But first to define local and regional governments here are basically the second and third tiers of government. We're talking about governorates in Egypt, states, provinces elsewhere, and then cities, villages, towns, municipalities, and so on and so forth. Now, that level of government obviously is the closest level of government to the target population in just about everything that concerns service delivery, and therefore, in accordance with the principle of subsidiarity, should be playing, obviously a key role, given that it has the best understanding and proximity to beneficiaries or users' needs. Now, local and regional governments play an important role in public investment. The figure globally is about 37% of total public investments are carried out by local and regional governments. And in fact, in OECD countries, that figure is much larger, at 60%. And at the same time, in addition to, if you will, everyday public investment, they've been stepping up, especially in this past decade or so, in responsibilities that, if you think about, have normally been part of the remit of national governments. So, for instance, on issues related to climate change, you've got the Global Covenant of Mayors that has about almost 10,000 municipalities and cities and local governments that are signatories towards the achievement of climate change. And this, in fact, that stepping up happened at the time when the Paris Agreement was having, if you will, its most serious crisis, when basically the US withdrew in 2016. In addition, you'll find that local and regional governments have also been stepping up in tackling a crisis like the refugee crisis. Whether in the Middle East with the Syrian refugees, or what's happening right now with the Ukrainian refugee crisis, with Poland and Moldova and Romania and other cities stepping up. So these have not normally been, if you will, part of the terms of reference of being a mayor. In addition, local and regional governments have been also increasingly upping their game, as champions for the implementation of the SDGs. The numbers here are a little bit smaller, but we have the New York City Declaration of 2018 that about 18 cities signed up to, which basically mandated cities to prepare voluntary ROCA reviews, echoing the national ROCA reviews prepared by national government. And at the same time, through this, show their commitment towards the implementation of the SDGs. Now here, there's not really official figures. We know that by the end of 2020, there are about 40 cities that were submitting VLRs, the voluntary ROCA reviews. The coverage is uneven in the sense that it's not a comprehensive tally of what they have done on all 17 SDGs. But for many of them, it was, a good first effort to show that they have an important role to contribute. Next slide, please. Now, why does it matter to have local and regional governments contributing towards the achievement of the SDGs? Well, for a starter, of the 17 goals, which have a total of 169 targets, SDGs are immediately concerned by somewhere between, close to 2/3 of these targets. 60 to 65% of those targets are things that SDGs, that LRGs, local and regional governments, can contribute directly to. One of them is obviously directly within their mandate, that's SDG 11 on cities, and then the others, whether they relate to infrastructure, service delivery, or economic development, poverty alleviation, etc., gender, and so on and so forth, are all things that SDGs can contribute to indirectly through their service delivery and contributions to economic development. But even, and that's the interesting part, even when you look at, SDGs that are not typically within the remit of local and regional governments, for instance, things related to climate or oceans or ecosystems, you'll find that, at least in OECD, SDGs are playing an important role. So in fact, 64% of total spending on the environment in OECD countries happens by local and regional governments. And that figure for climate change is 55%. So it's not, that they just, are investing in the SDGs that are straightforward service delivery SDGs, but also in others that are part of that global public goods. And moreover, cities in developing countries are about 60% of the membership of C40, which is a group of cities that are taking, important action towards climate change. Now, at the same time, and that's the emphasis of the book about the notion of localization is, as Dr. Mahmoud said in the beginning, we don't want this to be just about decentralization, but it's about combining the benefits of both decentralization and centralization. So centralization basically gives you access to higher resources, more capacity, and then the notion is to try to align these towards local priorities. And you combine that with decentralization, with the enhanced accountability that local and regional governments have towards communities, then you get, if you will, the best of both worlds through an approach about localization. Moreover, I mean, SDGs are to better understand how we can achieve them, to better understand the gaps towards their achievement, we often need a territorial approach, because, I mean, when you get a national figure of, this is, the level of achievement of, poverty alleviation, of hunger, etc., having spatially disaggregated understanding of where might be the lagging regions in terms of the achievement of the SDGs becomes important for governments at both central and local level to deploy the resources towards the coverage of those gaps. Lastly, local and regional governments matter because they are central to some of those trends that are critical towards the achievement of the SDGs. So for starters, urbanization, as the world is urbanizing and rather rapidly, cities usually, when they're managed well, are an escalator out of poverty. So, I mean, if you will, the achievement of SDG 1 will link one way or the other to an urbanization trend to which local and regional government are a critical, if you will, force in harnessing that force. Same thing about tackling climate action. There 70% of greenhouse gas emissions are taking place in cities. And then lastly, as I mentioned, that ability to adopt a spatial and territorial approach that enables us to have a better understanding of where disparities are taking place and what needs to be done in terms of targeting the places that have been left behind so that you leave no one behind. Next slide, please. So what's holding them back from progressing towards the achievement of the SDGs? So, I mean, Miral and Dr. Mahmoud covered, quite a bit about the challenges related to the SDGs, which obviously affect both levels of government, and that's, when their targets are not defined, when some of the achievement of the SDGs do not link to the planetary boundaries, etc. That's something that we can discuss if you want in the subsequent conversation. But in general, the key challenges that face local and regional governments from, and if you're curtailing them from helping much more significantly towards the achievement of the SDGs are the following. The first is obviously the notion of devolution. I mean, when local and regional governments do not control the main levers related to planning and service delivery responsibilities, obviously their ability to contribute becomes more limited. And you've got anywhere from a range where you look at local and regional governments who have powers over land use planning, who have powers over service delivery, etc., towards a notion of local authorities, towards a notion of local administrations, which are basically, or in some cases, deconcentrated entities of national government. So that range means also a much more limited role in certain settings when they're not devolved, if you will, planning and service delivery powers. By the same token, and actually at a much larger scale, is, because oftentimes you find local and regional governments with the responsibilities, but without, if you will, the adequate resources with which to finance these responsibilities. Now, that includes, regulatory constraints on their ability to generate own source revenues, whether they can raise taxes or not, and at the same time also on their creditworthiness. And you often also find the situation where local governments are creditworthy, but are legally constrained in terms of their ability to borrow from capital markets. And you've got, in fact, local governments that have higher credit would have had higher credit ratings than the national government had they been allowed, if you will, to go on external borrowing. Capacity challenges also abound, and here the challenge becomes about how do you build capacity for those local governments that have weaker capacities, but also, and that cuts across, in fact, if you will, the better endowed local and regional governments and those with less capacity, the challenges of institutional coordination. That's both horizontally. In fact, a lot of, if you will, cities and urban areas are in fact metropolitan regions that involve a group of municipalities that each have fragmented powers of land use planning, of service delivery, often without limited coordination. I mean, the metropolitan region of Sao Paulo is basically 39 local governments that need to act together. Rio de Janeiro, it's 19. Even Cairo, I mean, Greater Cairo region, comprises of multiple governorates as well. And at the same time, vertically, I mean, the challenges of coordinating vertically between levels of government. And again, this happens in a lot of countries, but I recall, for the first time in 2014 in Brazil, and it was at the time the 6th largest economy in the world, we could tabulate manually what is being spent on water and sanitation and on service delivery within the metropolitan region of Sao Paulo by tabulating across 3 levels of government and their investments. So, I mean, so that, if you will, challenges of coordination, both vertically and horizontally abound. Miral spoke extensively about data, so I don't need to, delve a lot in there. And then we also have, a misalignment between cities in terms of their functional jurisdictions and their administrative jurisdictions that prevents the ability to account for what is being invested where. And then lastly, of course, there's a misalignment between the SDGs and local development plans. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now, COVID further set back the achievement of the SDGs. I think a lot has been written about that in terms of, the challenges that it brought about in terms of job losses, in terms of economic contraction, rising poverty and inequality, obviously the education losses, the setback in terms of public health. And for municipalities in particular, also a decline in municipal revenues associated with the limitations on economic activities, etc. So even for those cities and local governments that were progressing towards the achievement of the SDGs, COVID set them back significantly. But at the same time, we've also seen responses, including things like cities working on improving livability, on investing in public spaces, in active mobility, on trying to reduce commuting distances, which have implications in terms of reducing greenhouse gases, air pollution, and so on, improving service delivery, investing in the places that have been left behind, which would be the pockets where that are further away from the achievement of the SDGs, whether it's slums, poor neighborhoods, and then improving, also trying to improve affordability. But the reality is clear. I mean, already the achievement of the SDGs was at risk before having COVID, and after COVID, it became further out. Next slide, please. Now, what is it that local and regional governments would need in order to be able to accelerate progress towards the SDGs? We spoke about decentralization. So, I mean, supporting decentralization of planning and service delivery, devolving more adequate resources, enabling them to generate more own source revenues, improving the intergovernmental fiscal transfers, supporting them on aspects related to capacity to attract private investment. That strengthening capacity becomes really critical because, I mean, lagging regions, the places that have been left behind, I mean, if we're talking about Egypt, then it's places in Upper Egypt, etc. It's the furthest, the most remote governorates and human settlements. I mean, trying to support the capacity in terms of service delivery. And there are service delivery solutions that do not per se requires economies of scale. I think, the interesting thing is there's a lot of technology out there that could help in decentralized service delivery. Aligning the administrative responsibilities with the functional areas to be able to support local and regional governments towards a more efficient and cost-effective service delivery. Strengthening the resilience. I mean, that's particularly, an area that's not receiving enough attention. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, it takes one earthquake, a few seconds, like what happened in Syria and in Turkey, in order to set back decades of development progress. I mean, so strengthening local governments' resilience, disaster and emergency preparedness becomes critical in terms of safeguarding the progress that happens towards the SDGs. strengthening community and citizen participation in this decision-making, improving data, and of course, access to technology. And last but not least, strengthening private sector and civil society's participation, because it really will require having all hands on deck. And with that, let me hand it over to Miral, whom I think is going to take us towards the conclusions.
Right. Perhaps to serve.
May I ask if Dr.
Yeah, I think it's better to.
Dr. Mahmoud, may I ask, you'd like to say a couple of.
Yeah, I was just trying, we need to hear from the discussants so we can conclude later. Yeah, thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Abla, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, congratulations, Dr. Mahmoud, you and your co-authors for an excellent book. It's a very smooth read. It's nice and very well organized, and it's evidence-based narrative that's showing a strong case for the need to speed up the implementation of the SDGs, the 2030 agenda, and also smoothly towards the responsibility of the national governments and the need for partnerships with businesses, with civil society, etc. So it's a good diagnosis and with a prescription on what needs to be done, very smooth. So really, congratulations. I have three scattered comments on things that were said, and I have one on the chapter that was very interesting for me, which is the very last one, about never let a good crisis go to waste. Okay, we're living in crises, so it's becoming a way of life, I suppose. Okay, my first comment relates to the data. Okay, the talk about the data. Miral, you mentioned that of course there is underinvestment by governments, by donors, and fragmentation. I want to add that data is old, and without updating, it's useless. And then there is an issue with sharing data. Okay, of course, this doesn't exist necessarily in every country, but I'm talking about the one I know best, all right? Sharing data, because data is in one place, the others cannot get it. And if they cannot get it, then they cannot benefit from it in improving the quality of the policy. And correctly so, it is the finance, the policy framework, and the data. If it's not there, you really cannot do anything. But I want to add to the data items one very important item related to SDGs, and that's the follow-up on the impact of the projects falling under the title of SDGs. For example, in Egypt, we have many projects coming from donors, okay? And more often than not, we hear we have 3 projects in addressing the SDG number 4 about the quality of education. And we have 3 on the gender equality, okay? The targets are already, I mean, the SDGs themselves are very general, all right? But then here you're not quite sure, okay, what is the impact of the project? It's as if having a project on this is an end in itself. So part of the data is to have the impact assessment of the projects that are implemented so that we really know that something is happening with the SDGs for it. So this is my first comment. My second comment relates to the developing countries, the LDCs, and how it was mentioned in the book that the capability and willingness of governments to mobilize and direct fiscal resources towards SDGs are actually limited and very significantly. I think it's important that we mention that many of the LDCs are burdened with debt. And I'm not talking about the debt financing climate, I'm talking about other debt. And it's very difficult to move forward in anything with this debt. So I think it's important to mention that. And I think it's also important to talk about preconditions of success of this entire exercise. Decentralization was mentioned, localization was mentioned. Dr. Mahmoud said we need decentralization and centralization, but unfortunately, systems that are heavily centralized do not allow for decentralization. And without decentralization, you don't have any role for LRGs. They're useless, really. In the case of Egypt, we have in the constitution in 2014, we have a very clear clause that's talking about decentralization. It was supposed to happen very quickly. Until today, we still do not have the law for decentralization. And this is really stopping a whole bunch of things. So I think this is extremely important. My third point relates to the private sector and its role. And this I enjoyed very much because impact investing is a concept that's new in our countries. We don't see it often. We've done a piece of research on it. to make it, to differentiate between it and CSR. Okay, private sector spend a lot on CSR, so you find him polluting the river, and then the next day he's building a hospital, okay, and cleaning the streets. But why don't you stop the pollution? All right. So to really have impact investment is something that we need badly, and it needs to be led by the big companies. It's something that we need to promote in the developing countries. Now, on the last point, which is most interesting for me, this never let a good crisis go to waste. I have to congratulate you on the title. It's very cute. You did not use silver lining, but it's saying actually basically the same thing. All right. COVID-19 exposed the complicated challenges, but at the same time, it allowed for digital transformation, climate change risk awareness, etc., etc. And the world is at a tipping point in history. Very true. Okay. But then there's a very interesting sentence that you guys wrote: responding well to COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine would lead to a shift of thinking about how to fix the system flaws. Okay, but we did not do well with either COVID-19 or with the war. All right, with COVID-19, you see what happened. For example, in Africa, which is one of the country, the continent that if anybody needs the SDGs, it's Africa more than anybody else. And then Africa actually received the lowest level of vaccination. Okay, and this is actually a big problem. So we did not do well there. Okay, we also did not do well with the war. The war in the Russian-Ukraine war led to a situation where the climate action started to take another shape. Coal is suddenly very nice when we can stay with the fossil fuels for a long while. There's nothing wrong with that. And at the same time, we're not allowing Africa to do proper manufacturing. And we know that the green energy is not going to allow for manufacturing. It cannot allow for manufacturing. It's only the green hydrogen, even from technology point of view, which means that there is actually, yes, climate and development are not supposed to be against each other, but realistically what is happening is that we are starting to see some contradictions within some of the SDGs. And for me, this is important because it means that we cannot, even though this is the focus of the book, and I accept, I understand, I appreciate very much, we cannot ignore the externalities that are there, and the externalities that what's coming from outside, okay, and the core of the entire problem that calls for the SDGs, and that's the very, very, very low voice of the South. Okay, we need. I keep saying that we need a new Bretton Woods agreement. We need a new economic order. We need a different system of operation for the World Bank, IMF, and UN agencies, in order to bring about lots of equality. You guys did not touch that in the book, and the title of the book is not dealing with it. But you do this incredible job when one is about to write and say, aha, I found something that needs working. The very last sentence is saying, updating the global social contract, which means that you guys are aware very much. You put it, you didn't write anything about it, but you've put it there. So you saved yourself from any criticism that you did not see. But I would say more about it than just a sentence, because this is really the core of the problem. Two last words. One, young people, okay, and the dynamism of the young people, I think, is important and needs to be there somewhere in this argument. I think it needs to be there because they are the ones that can make a difference with the developing countries and to make things be done right as per the prescription you provide. My very last point, Dr. Mohieldin, I need a copy of the book at ECS. We publish a new book every Thursday, so do send me a link so that we publish it on Thursday and say we're very proud to have this excellent book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abla. I think we're ready to go to Sarah, where Maria had shared the link to the book, so I'm going to share it with you in an email as well. Sarah?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Shireen, and thank you so much for inviting me to this important discussion of a very interesting book that I really enjoyed reading and indeed added to my humble knowledge. Excuse my voice, I'm a little bit sick. Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud, and all the distinguished authors for the knowledge provided in this book. I would divide my discussion into two parts. highlighting mainly two important parts that I liked mostly in the book, and what I would think of building upon or taking forward beyond the book, in future works. The book is very insightful, and what I liked most about the book is the concept. Two main concepts. The first one is how it addressed the problem of SDGs and trying to instill the concept again and again that SDGs are not something that we are trying to reach a progress towards, but it's rather the system that can help and provide this roadmap for recovery, as was said. And the reflection or the referring to the book that I also enjoyed reading before, The Resilient Society, how important it is to build systems in order and mechanism to acknowledge shocks rather than resist them. I think this is what we really need in light of what even Dr. Abla just mentioned, the continued and the perma-crisis, like you say, Dr. Mahmoud, the new terminology. So this is the first concept that I really enjoyed and liked, and I believe it should be further stressed on. The second concept is about trying also to advocate that there is no trade-offs between something like the climate and the development finance. There is a need for synergies rather than trade-offs. And what we say that the climate problem is not a luxurious problem or something that is on vogue today, and as some people try to simplify it. The book provided evidence and analysis and important discussions about how the climate problem, the deterioration in the climate-related pillars, being pillar 13, but it affected, yes, indeed, it's one pillar, but it affected, and if not addressed properly, will affect other SDGs, mainly, of course, poverty and inequality as it's going through the book. So this is another concept that was instilled in the book in a very simple way. That I really enjoyed. The second thing that I really enjoyed about the book is the approach and the narrative. The narrative and the thread of the book. The approach, it's all about discussing roles and the responsibilities of actors. It defined actors and the respective roles and responsibilities for implementing SDGs in a very simple articulation and connecting the dots. I think it started with the government, the national government, the business sector, the local and the regional, and then ending, of course, with the political economy aspects, as Dr. Abla said, also by never letting a good crisis go to waste, addressing the importance of many things. The most important things, in my very humble opinion, is the accountability systems, how to build accountable system, how to hold different roles and different actors accountable for their roles, and not just stopping at, we're very good at defining, making systems, building institutions, building regulations, but how to hold people accountable for committing. We have a lot of previous agendas, but how to hold different actors accountable for implementing these goals. So this is something that I also really enjoyed in the book. What if I would think to build upon or take forward beyond this book, I would think of adding another layer of actors, or what I see a relevant actor with relevant role, which is the society. We can no longer look at the society as a recipient or an end user of this public-private system or public-private engagement. Actually, we have seen and we have witnessed, and it's today and forever, that the society had a role in either accelerating or slowing down the change. We have all seen the role of the society during the pandemic, for example, the mask policies, the lockdown policies, and so on. The concept of nudging and soft interventions, it's something that also requires close studying. I would say, for example, in the case of circular economy, the examples on circular economy, behavioral nudging in circular economy is an area that needs multi-stakeholder approach that involves the national, the local governments, as well as the business. Here, the localization of behavioral nudges would also be important and would add another role and another layer for subnational and local governments at the localization of behavioral nudges. For example, a climate nudge that can work in Berlin cannot work in Cairo. A nudge that can work in Kafr Shukr cannot work in Zifta or in Naga Hamadi or wherever. So experimentation and behavioral change in implementing SDGs is a role that can be played not just by is what?
Is universal. If it
yes.
If it is applied in Kafr Shukr, it could apply anywhere. This is the only exception.
Okay.
Not
Okay.
just
Okay. Taken. Not taken. Thank you, Doctor. So just saying that experimentation and the behavioral changes in implementing SDGs is something that is a role that can be played by governments and by also the business sector, seeing the society as an actor and enabler in the implementation of the SDGs. The next point that I want to reflect is just a reflection on the debt problem and how was it addressed in the book. Since we are discussing the implementation of SDGs, in most parts of the book, it addressed the debt problem as a country-level fiscal problem that needs to be tackled through proper public administrations and working out solutions to close the financing gap, revisiting stimulus packages, issues like that. This is important, of course, but now, a closer look on the debt problem and as part of the SDGs implementation agenda and the public-private approach also requires an understanding and instilling that the debt problem is not just this one simply existing in countries and regions and that is aggregated that aggregates to form a global debt crisis. Actually, the consequent debt waves and the current what we call the debt roller coaster shows that the debt problem is evolving not in size and implications, but also in the drivers, the sophistications, how it is addressed. If we looked at the debt problem 1.5 years ago, we would find that this debt was driven by a global low interest environment, loose monetary conditions, advocacy for post-COVID stimulus. If we looked at it little older, we would see that it's driven by increased non-government finance, private cheap finance, unmonitored debt in emerging markets, and so on. If we looked at it today, we would find that a war-fueled global environment compounded with this high interest rates and so on, and also the big problem, which is the currency composition of the debt. I will give an example of I have it in front of me, a recent UNCTAD report. It says, by the end of November 22, at least 88 countries experienced a depreciation against the dollar. In 31 of these countries, the depreciation was beyond or greater than 10%. This is what is called the heavy burden of the strong dollar. This has an implication. This is the international financial system. So the debt problem is beyond the idea of addressing debt reliefs, addressing public administration, debt restructuring, and so on. And here, I'm so happy that Dr. Abla said the same thing that I was just going, I had in my discussion written the case for a new Bretton Woods, the book that was published last year and also mentioned this year, 3 weeks ago by the UN Secretary General, that it's the time for a new Bretton Woods moment and addressing the the need for a new international financial system that acknowledges the global financial challenges, aligning them to something like the climate agenda and the development agenda. Things like aligning to the economic governance with the global economic governance with the shared climate goals, regulating the private capital flows towards the low carbon activities, reorienting trade and investment incentives away from the, for example, fossil fuel and towards more green and inclusive activities and so on. So aligning that to the climate agenda is no longer a surprise and it's now established. And also, bottom line is that in a new financial system, that and a very dynamic and challenging system, we need to look at the debt problem beyond the idea of debt reliefs, debt finance, and so on. We need to look at it and how to align it to the development agenda and the climate agenda. I'm sorry if I exceeded my time, Dr. Shireen. Thank you so much again. I'm sorry for my voice.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Shall we go straight to you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dr. Shireen, for inviting me to this important and informative discussion. Dr. Mahmoud, the co-authors, congratulations on the great book. It's of course, timely, very rich, and holistic by nature. So it's discussing a holistic thing, and it's going also holistic. The best thing I liked about the book is going vertically and horizontally. So going horizontally among sectors, and the coherence is counted very important between sectors, and also vertically between the layers of the government in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The thing is, the global crisis will continue to happen, and in different shapes, and they continue to be affecting the SDGs status in different countries, but with different intensities, because the crises are coming, or the disruptions, in different forms and different shapes. So when it comes to resilience and building resilience, it should be more agile, or we have to think about how to make it not just resilient to a certain type of crisis, because the crisis is changing its shape. So the preventive methods actually should come at the three layers. I think you discussed the economic resilience, the social resilience, and also the climate resilience. The book has covered this very smartly. Within this context, I would suggest something to build on this, adding two more players to this game next to the government and also the business sector, which are the international sector, or the international trade community, because this will affect how what are the speeds of the countries. Because, and I will discuss this more further, the second player is the community, which is close to what Sarah mentioned, the society, the community, and the culture. And this comes very intensively affecting the local level and the solutions at the local level at the bottom approach. When it comes to the international trade, for example, or international sector, I can think about the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism that was recently approved by the European Union Council last year, and is coming effective in October this year. The speed of countries' alignment with this will affect heavily the gap between countries in their economic development. Some countries who will not be able to align quickly will not have access to European market, and it will affect the poverty level, and will affect the GDP, and will make the Sustainable Development Goals more worse in these countries. So now there is a trade-off between ESGs and policies related to climate action, which are non-price competition, versus how does this affect the countries that cannot align with this price competition mechanisms. The speed of the countries will make the situation worse for some countries, and increase the divide between countries until they align. So it depends about the speed. So again, the actor or the player in this sphere, which is the international sector, may affect the overall and the individual countries' achievements in relation to the SDGs. When it comes to the supply chain, for example, also this is another angle for the international trade. This type of tax, of carbon tax in the EU, may change the supply chain completely, the map and the design of supply chain, and will deprive some countries completely from being part of the supply chain, and will affect the comparative advantage accordingly. So this is one dimension. Also, when it comes to the community or the culture at the local level, and this brings us to the idea of industrial symbiosis or industrial ecology at the local level, and getting use of digital transformation to apply the circular economy methods at the local level. This would be very helpful if we want to empower the last mile delivery. when it comes especially to eco-industrial parks or Internet of Things tools that may help exchanging waste and achieving profits for business sector. Here comes the business sector, and at the same time saving the environment. Also digital transformation and maybe the fintech thing would help the community to crowdfund for the climate change. This is another angle where community can be involved in the climate action, also climate action finance. These are some ideas, and thank you so much for giving me the chance to read this great work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mahmoud, would you like to come in with some concluding remarks and reactions to our panelists?
Sure. Let me just check with my colleagues if they have any quick reactions. Dr. Maria Alejandra.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much to all of you, Dr. Abla, Dr. Susanna, Dr. Sara. Thank you for reading our book with such enthusiasm and with such careful, and with providing so really valuable insights, and your the comments that you gave us like put everything just one step ahead. Some comments and some reply that I want to comment. Dr. Abla, I agree with you on the importance of impact investment and the importance also of these making these within the investment community, this movement for this concessional type of investment, in where sometimes like we can have a bit more of return in the short term, but being aware that if we do this impact investment in the long term, we can have a longer impact, especially that we can reduce risk. So I'm totally aware with you on the importance of impact investment and on the importance of sacrificing just tiny bit of the returns in the short term. So thank you for that. Thank you, Dr. Susanna, for this, emphasizing this importance of resilience and the importance of being agile, because speeds matter here. We have in this moment, in this decade that requires a lot of us. It's the decade of implementation, the decade of restoration, and the decade of acceleration. So speeds played a huge role here. And as it was presented by Dr. Sarah, this one is not going to, and is not voluntarily anymore, but many markets. And it's not voluntarily because everything that it used to be voluntary, right now it is going to be compulsory by markets, compulsory by regulations. So what these things that used to be just a base of goodwill of companies or governments, they are sooner and sooner becoming requirements either by markets or by government. So I just want to say thank you to three of you for your comments and for your replies, and yeah, for being aligned with us in the messages.
Dr. Sameh, Miral, any quick points? I think we have a minute left, so it'll be very brief, all of them. Yeah.
Nothing to add, but to thank the three reviews. I mean, really appreciate the points, very much appreciate the point about resilience, about the debt, and I know you're going to tackle this, Dr. Mahmoud, so I'll just, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Miral?
Nothing to add. I just want to thank all of you for your interventions, and I want to thank my three co-authors, because it was so hard to actually be the youngest in the team, but they never belittled any of my interventions. So I'm so thankful for the three of them. I'm learning a lot from you.
Well, SDGs is about your generation, so I think it's fair for you to take a leading work on it, and I'd like to thank you in public for your excellent work and saving us in this presentation and beyond. Let me just very quickly appreciate, of course, the excellent interventions and comments and the time taken by the three discussants, Dr. Abla, Dr. Susanna, and Dr. Sarah. for the time we spent on their busy schedules to reflect on this book and give us some ideas as well to develop some of the work going forward in the future. I'm happy that you all picked in different ways the importance of the system approach to development. I agree with the issues related to implementation and the matters related to coordination, and that they've been picked in different ways in your comments. The issue here, what could really be the most practical way of getting implementation right? What I see, it could be a naive proposition, but I see it like the ultimate document that can really get the priorities right of any country in a nation is the budget of the state, from the way it is being designed, from the way it links the priorities, and the way it links to the center, no, I wouldn't say to the peripheries, but to the local and regional entities. And the way that budget should be designed in the future could be the answer on these gaps. We see carefully written visions. I've been attending all of these HLPF or high-level policy fora at the UN for many years, either through internal resources or the help by the UN or by consultants. All of these visions looks colorful enough, insightful enough, but it's all about how to translate them into action in the field. And the funny thing is, I'm not forgetting that I'm advising the Secretary General and his team as an envoy on this matter. I see a disconnect and a divorce between the vision discussions in July and the discussion about finance for development, which is basically the public, private, domestic, external sources of finance, the integrated national financial framework, which is missing in many countries, issues related to trade and debt management, and the rest of enablers, which is basically technology. It's about time. Well, if there is a failure at the global level, because those two tracks are coming from two mandates and decisions by the UN, it's basically needed to be solved at the national level, and we need to discuss the priorities on the SDGs at the same time that we discuss the priorities when it comes to the issues related to how to finance them. And this is actually one of the lessons of from the MDGs, that Addis agenda was actually agreed upon in July 2015 before we went into September 2015 to agree on the SDGs, and before we went to Paris in December 2015 to agree on the climate action, which is related to what we're talking about. I think unless you have some sophisticated ways of getting the system together, and there are many ways about it institutionally, but I think the critical minimum should come from the budget of the state, which is not really the case in most of the countries. And I've been calling for an SDG-based or SDG-guided kind of budgeting that could really be the way to make this kind of gluing and opening the system widely, and to break the silos and make the connections required. Then this issue on debt, yes, it's a challenge. And the dependence on debt finance, not just a problem in climate, but on the rest of the SDGs, because the budget of the state is busy with major fixed items, wages, salaries, and debt service. So anything of what we talked about now needs to be dealt with through budget deficit finance. And even if we assume that the private sector is willing to do some work, it cannot really do it in social infrastructure. It can do that more on the infrastructure, including digital and some of the aspects related to growth and resilience, but not all of the agenda. It's basically designed for a much more clever partnership. I agree with the points raised on impact investing and how to do that better. I think there is a room for getting the think tanks, including ECS and ERF, to work together on how to get the global standards nationalized. There is a new 10 recommendations report on integrity of ESG, and this is the way to assess impact investing. Because now, without having the standard on ESG, everybody can talk about anything, because we don't really have a matrix. Unlike accounting standards or auditing standards, ESG does not have a good reference. So anybody can really claim anything, including the good points mentioned by Dr. Abla. If they built a hospital, is it ESG or not? If it is beautifying a square somewhere, is it public relations or is it impact investing? Is it part of the core business, or it is just something to perhaps to greenwash some of the activities? So that will not be solved without good ESG standards and full compliance with that. On finance, I like, because it came out after this report, I encourage you to have a look at the policy brief that came out from the Secretary General of the UN on the acceleration and the stimulus for achieving the SDGs, which has a nice common sense approach that could answer the questions raised by the three of you. It has first deal with the debt issues. The second is long-term for concessional finance. And the third is basically about contingency funding and how to get that all in order to save the time towards 2030. The very final point is basically about building a new financial system. There are two ways to go about it: either to muddle through the system, which is basically many people are doing now. The system that we inherited is basically the system that came out through the winners of the Second World War, of which time the developing economies that we're talking about, many of them were not even in existence as countries. Many of them were basically under occupation. They had no contribution in designing this Bretton Woods system. So I would say the third or fourth best approach is to tinker with whatever we have of the Bretton Woods system and make it get more efficient, more benign, supportive to the SDGs, helping and leveraging. But definitely coming from a developing economy, building a new system is basically could benefit more from the kind of experiments that we're seeing now in the China-based kind of institutions, AIB, the BRICS Bank or the New Development Bank, learning from the good things and the bad things committed by the older institutions. And definitely we need something to fix this awful arrangements in the IFIs in which developing economies do not have a fair share in the vote. It's a quota-based system, and the quota is linked to a very hard formula that doesn't really reflect the new political world order that is still in the making. But until that new world order is being defined, but at least realizing the differences in weights of the developing economies and emerging markets were not in 1945 anymore, but unfortunately, many powers do not like to realize that. And they are wise, because if they start to realize it, they are going to be up to engaging in a completely different system from the one that we have. So it's not a new Bretton Woods system. It is going to be beyond that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. Thank you, Dr. Maria, Sameh, Miral, Dr. Abla, Suzanne, Sarah. A really rich discussion, most enjoyable. The recording is there and available. We'll be sharing the link. And congratulations again to the authors for a superb book, much needed. A lot of good discussion. I've also put into the chat at some point a recent book published by ERF on embarking on the path of renewal that you might want to check out. And looking forward to our next meeting together with a new book or a new intervention. Thank you very much for a very good discussion. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye to you all.